Hi, this is Mark of SeaScience Film Labs. The following is an edited video of an open mic night at Standing for Truth channel here on YouTube. Come on in and join the fun some night. They have open mic nights now. This particular video, Lucy's unique iliac flare video, begins with the Great Lucy debate that was also held on SFT's channel, where I describe the ilium of the Lucy pelvis that's included in the Lucy conglomeration, and particularly why I question the flare of the ilium of Lucy as evidence for her being transitional form between some hypothetical ancient chimpanzee ancestor and modern humans. If you enjoy this kind of content, subscribe for tons of fun to come. And thanks for watching. Let's get it in. Now, when you actually start to research it and you go and you find the dimensions that were given by Lovejoy, who was the one that actually interpreted the fossils and the pelvic remains, you find that the dimensions are quite like a human sacrum, and we'll get into that in a second. But I just want to put that my position is that that is a human sacrum, and that these conglomerations are made up of human and tree-dwelling ape remains of animals and humans that you can still find today modernly. Some of them have been reconstructed, and if you find ones that are different or out of the range of humanity or out of the range of a chimp, it's probably because of the fossilization process deforming them, or somebody, reconstructing one of these pieces or one of these remains, and then finding that it's outside of range of one of the modern animals now. But you can see which ones have been reconstructed and which ones were found in a whole piece. As far as this Lucy sacrum here, this sacrum, this human-looking sacrum that is included in the AL 288-1 conglomeration, it is the same dimensions as a human sacrum, and discovered with the sacral vertebrae fused together.
Right, like Lucy, her pelvis, because I know you said it's just a human pelvis in the past. First of all, it's tiny. You should see this thing; it's very small. But moreover, and it's an adult, so that's.
Well, I would say it's a pygmy human. So
right. So that thing has an iliac flare to it, right? So an iliac flare is a flare at the proximal portion, superior portion, I guess I should say, of the blade. No non-Australopith has that. Australopithecus sediba has the flare, Australopithecus africanus has the flare, and this specimen, quote unquote, Australopithecus prometheus, also has it.
Now, the ilium is the wing, the pelvic wing, basically the pelvic blade that goes off of the sacrum. It connects to the sacrum, and it's also where the femur connects to the hip. The hip is the hip bone. So scrolling down, we'll see Lucy. This is Lucy's hip bone, which looks quite human, but I know it looks different. But there's a reason for that. You see, that ilium there that you see the arrow pointing to is reconstruction, and they actually put that together piece by piece. That's one of the bones that was actually pulled out of the hillside instead of pulled off the surface, that didn't erode out of the hillside, because that's why it's reconstructed, I guess, is it was pulled out of the hillside piece by piece and then stuck together with some kind of epoxy. And that's what you have there. Now, the one on the left side is a replica of an inverted replica of the one on the right. So, like I said, if you reflect what you have, then if it's a bipedal thing, you should be able to see the other side too, which makes sense. Scrolling down, we'll see, according to Donald Johansen, the paleoanthropologist who discovered Lucy conglomeration, the ilium was fragmented when he first saw it, and several pieces were missing. In his book, Lucy, The Beginnings of Humankind, Johansen describes how he and his team excavated the fragments of ilium from the side of the eroding hill and reconstructed the ilium included in the AL 288-1 conglomeration. We turn to the ilium, the large hip bone, which was badly fragmented. The back edge was missing, as was the upper portion near the hip joint. The remaining pieces, however, showed that the bone was curved like a hockey stick. We excavated slowly, removing the bone bit by bit, and placed the fragments together like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. By the end of the day, we had reconstructed a large part of the ilium. So go on and scroll down there. You'll see the this is the human sacrum. That's it. That's pictured in that comparison, and or featured in that comparison there, and it's also with its ilia. Now it's important to note that between the ilium here, and you can see it, so this is a perfect place for it to stop. The ilium of the human is less flared than the ilium of the Lucy, of the AL288-1 conglomeration. Okay, so the ilium included in there has this flare, and that's what a lot of people are talking about, is that it's more flared than a modern human sacrum, and that's what the big difference is. And once you realize that it's a reconstruction and they shaped it themselves, you know, the ilium is pretty much disqualified, in my opinion, as far as something that could be used as evidence for one of these Australopithecine, or we should really look into, or they should make it available enough to make sure that they didn't, you know, manufacture what that's supposed to look like. Because especially when you look at the sacrum and how human it is and what they actually say about it themselves, like the doctors that discovered it, which we're going to get into next.
Moreover, they match in their scapulae. They match in their femoral morphology, as I showed you. So like Lucy's femur looks like this thing's femur, which looks like what we have for Australopithecus sediba. This is acting as a great confirmation of the other Australopith morphology. True, but we didn't need it because, as I said last time, Australopithecus sediba already did it, because as you said, if you want to take Ella Bin's argument,
right,
you've got
this is the flare you're talking about, the B, right? Example B.
That looks right.
That's Lucy's pelvis?
Yes,
right.
Yes. So it's a flare at the tip. Only Australopiths have it, and the reason is unknown. I've heard people.
No, well, because if you look at this example here, Native Americans have a bit of a flare.
Right,
Erectus, Neanderthal, Hobbit, and Naledi, who we would say are human, all have a flare as well. So this is just normal variation in the human group.
That's not a flare, Donnie. Like, this stuff has quantitative like measurements to go with it. Humans do not. There's not a single human pelvis that falls into the flare range, not one. And all Australopiths have it. Like this is what I feel like you're missing here, right? Like, I'm going to send you these papers, and what I
wait, are you saying Hobbit doesn't have a flare?
The iliac flare?
Yes.
No, I don't believe so. Although I've heard people argue, I don't think so. I don't think it has the iliac flare. Check. But what I was going to say is that
I thought it did have the flare, which is why some would argue that Hobbit is the result of an Australopithecine.
I always heard Matt Kochiri base it on the trapezium.
Okay.
Of LB1. No, but the last thing is I'm going to send you these papers, and the reason is because, okay, iliac flaring is described as marked, but my understanding here is that it's not on the level of an Australopith. So it's more than a human, but not in the Australopith range. Let me see. Flare, I'll just do marked here. Marked degree.
No, okay, let's talk about this too. This is the chimpanzee sacrum. And like I said, another misconception that's going around being pushed is that humans are apes by these guys. Humans are not apes. They all have a sacrum like this. Human sacrums are much different. Okay? You can tell a human sacrum from an ape sacrum. That's how you know humans are not apes. It's also my opinion that the flare of Lucy's ilia really doesn't matter, considering it's a reconstructed ilia. And fossils, also when it comes to fossils, if you're looking at a flare or a bend or a curve of a fossil, you got to imagine that the fossilization process does deform fossils. There's a lot of pressure, there's a lot of time. So basing all your argument off of a curved bone is very poor evidence, in my opinion.
And what I
wait, are you saying Hobbit doesn't have a flare?
The iliac flare?
Yes.
No, I don't believe so. Although I've heard people argue, I don't think so. I don't think it has the iliac flare. Check. But what I was going to say is that
I thought it did have the flare, which is why some would argue that Hobbit is the result of an Australopithecine.
I always heard Matt Kochiri base it on the trapezium.
Okay.
Of LB1. No, but the last thing is I'm going to send you these papers, and the reason is because, okay, iliac flaring is described as marked, but my understanding here is that it's not on the level of an Australopith. So it's more than a human, but not in the Australopith range. Let me see. flare. I'll just do marked here. Marked degree. Let me see. I'll try to find more on this. It wouldn't surprise me, but the
what about Naledi though, Erica? I'm sorry to interrupt. Naledi displays a pretty wide flaring iliac blade. No.
No, like look at the difference. You see how perpendicular to what would be the spinal column the Hobbit is as compared to Naledi, which comes in at an angle. Naledi doesn't have the flare. So the problem with this is, so you could say, I mean, if you want to say that the Hobbit is not in humankind, that's fine. But like,
well, no, I would say Hobbit is human. That's my point. Is we find humans in the fossil record with the iliac flare. One could argue that's normal human variation.
One couldn't though, Donnie, because
I do want to make one point, because I believe there is research to be done here. Okay. I am doing a little bit of it. Chris Roop has active research projects on it. But I would also argue that it's overall agnostic, because as you know, Erica, there are those in the young earth creationist community like Todd Wood, like Matthew McLean, like Marcus Ross, who would look to some of these features that are closely in line with human features as being the result of common design, natural variation within extinct ape groups, basically. And they would look to statistical baraminology, and they would look to morphological and anatomical discontinuities to say that they are separate from humans, although very similar to humans. Now, I'm not saying I necessarily lean that way, but it is a possible position to lean towards. Does that make sense, Erica?
So I'm fine with that. That's what Peter of Paleologos holds to. That's totally fine. And what he and I argue about is what's sort of the proverbial next step here, right? Which is, can you see this morphology change over time? And is it possible to distinguish Australopiths from early genus Homo, and then early genus Homo from mid genus Homo, et cetera, et cetera? Can you demarcate it? And Peter would argue yes, and I would argue no. And one of my big questions that I posed to Peter is that when I looked at his statistical baraminology, and you know, they have these clusters, right? That's how statistical baraminology works. They got the clusters. Is that applied in a standard way to other animals that discriminates in the same way, right? Like, is it going to discriminate, like, let's say, different canids from one another? Because again, I find it suspicious in the same way that I find Tompkins' work suspicious, is that it's applied exclusively to hominins, although I don't think they're doing that on purpose. I don't know.
I think, like you said, if you go the route of some young earth creationists where they make statistical baraminological analyses paramount, then it is going to come down to how significant or great those discontinuities are. I'd rather look to genetic related discontinuities like the Y chromosome. Erica, I'd love to have a conversation with you on that in the future. But I also wanted to address this real quick, Erica, and then we'll give you some final words. But we're almost at 5 hours and I'm going to have to start wrapping it up. But I do want to give you final words real quick. But I also want to address SeaScience here. And so, no, I didn't say that I specifically believe that Hobbit should be Australopithecus floresiensis. No, I'm just pointing out that there are some in the paleoanthropological community that would say Hobbit's precursor was not necessarily Erectus, but an Australopithecine. I would look to Hobbit as being a human suffering from island dwarfism. Anyways, Erica, go ahead. Speak to that if you'd like to. Have some final words, and I think we'll start to
Sure. So a couple of things, right? So I want to send you the paper so you can see the layout of STW 573, which portions are directly articulated, which portions are imperative to the argument here. I want to send you the paper for the limb proportions as well. I'll send you a bunch, and hopefully you'll look at it and you'll see, because they've got some great charts in there. It's all linear measurements. Like, something that I feel like people don't appreciate in paleoanthropology is that it's all gross anatomy. Like, that's almost all it is, at least where I work, right? It's calipers and linear measurements and statistical analysis to see where things plot in relation to one another. So STW 573 plots with the other Australopiths in the vast majority of cases. That's why it's so important, because it is not exceptional for an Australopith in any of its measurements, which means every other Australopith interpretation, including Lucy and Australopithecus sediba, is correct, right? They're not plotting with humans. They're plotting with SCW 573. They're plotting with a basal Australopith. I would actually tend to agree with Donnie on the Homo floresiensis thing. I don't think this thing came from an Australopith directly. I think it came from habilis. That's my opinion. And the reason for that is Matt Tachiri's work again. He's got the some of the carpals, and the carpals are a dead wrist. Those are the bones of the wrist. They're a dead ringer for Australopith wrist bones. But we don't have any wrist bones like that are clockable, that are matchable from Australopithecus to Homo habilis to the Lingua LB1 specimen, right? Like carpals are not like there's like, you know, a million of them in your wrist, and they don't tend to preserve very well. So I don't think you can make the claim that it comes from directly from an Australopith, at least not at present. I don't buy it, at least. I think a better argument is Homo habilis, personally.
Well, I do appreciate that. Please do send me those articles, because Chris Roop's work on it does seem promising. I don't think I'm at liberty to advance anything.
Don't get yourself in trouble.
Right. So, but I'd love to join him on some of the research being done on Littlefoot. Send me those articles. He has confirmed with me that.
I urge you, I'm urging you here, right? Like, the biomechanics are critical here. Roop needs to pay attention not just to the bones themselves, but the portions of the bone that are muscle attachment sites, the portions of the bone that are different relative to other Australopiths. All this stuff has to be taken into consideration when you're talking about not just how bipedal not whether or not it is bipedal, excuse me, but how efficient of a biped it is. And all of that comes into play. There's not a single paleoanthropologist, not a single person who studies biomechanics, not a single individual in paleoanthropology who thinks, maybe Esteban-Sarmiento, I guess, for like Ardipithecus, but who thinks that these early hominins weren't bipedal. Right? They just argue about how much time these things are still spending in the trees. And I'll tell you, I think it's still a substantial amount. Honestly, I think that given the arms of when you look at Littlefoot, look at the arms on this thing. It plots almost with a chimp in how long its arms are relative to its legs. And yet it's got modern hands and it's got an inline big toe. I mean, it's insane. This thing is a weird animal. It's very basal Australopith indeed. But yeah, I'll send them all to you.
I appreciate that. Like I said earlier, there are options and multiple working hypotheses, which I believe are important. I'm trying to look at this as objectively as possible, recognizing that there are the existence of artificial species, wastebasket taxons. I understand you wouldn't agree with me to the degree of which, but if we were to, as creationists, take Littlefoot and put Littlefoot into the Australopithecine ape category, then it's going to come down to, are there enough discontinuities in the morphology and anatomy to adequately separate, basically?
That's correct. Extinct,
yes. Right. Okay. And that's where the debate would go.
That's where it would go. And the question would then become, as I believe it was Bill Kimball in his article, Australopithecus to Homo, the transition that wasn't, how can you delineate with a sharp line like that actually is capable of discriminating the late Australopiths from early genus Homo? And I would propose that it can be done.
Currently, I'm more confident at the genetic discontinuities than the morphological and anatomical discontinuities in just bones, like extinct bones, right? So that is, I think, where a lot of the research needs to be focused. I think there are some creationists obviously focusing on that in terms of baraminology, Erica. But, you know, I'd like us to, for sure, continue this conversation. Send me those articles, and I'd be happy to look at them, and we'll kind of go from there. And Erica, hopefully you can join future open mics, and maybe, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, check out my Paranthropus video as well. There's not DNA that they've pulled from Paranthropus. It's proteins. So, but I still think it's really interesting. It's ancient proteins. It's informative for phylogeny, and I think that you should take a look at that.
And now a word from our very own Richard Samson of SeaScience Film Labs.
Well, it's a very general question because you seem to be asking about the whole Australopithecine species. You know,
I am. Yes, I am. Do you think any Australopith occupies an intermediate position?
So what you're asking me, do I think that there's any skeleton maybe that would point to the direction that humans evolved from some ancestor of chimpanzees?
I'm asking, do you think Australopithecus is a human ancestor?
What is it?
Is Australopithecus
Sasquatch?
a human ancestor? In your opinion?
Sasquatch? Well,
oh no!
Human ancestor.
Oh no! Oh no!
I believe the Bible. Yeah,
Forrest,
I believe the Bible. I believe that God made mankind. Yeah, because I called it
Dude, it took us 29 minutes and 29 seconds to get here, but we finally got there. Okay, you're a creationist.
I'm not even convinced this whole thing was a troll to watch how I use that mute